the US oil price, something we're keeping a very close eye on, but Donald Trump adamant that he wants to reopen the economy. What's the latest there?
Yeah, he certainly is, Laura. He's been obviously pressuring the state governors as much as he possibly can. He's also been encouraging those a lot of small protests around the US. In fact, we're seeing a lot more here today as well. They're small and they're organised by conservative groups, but they're certainly getting a lot of airplay here, and that's going to increase the pressure on the governors. And what we're seeing now is really interesting in the last 24 hours. Very, very small parts of America are just tentatively opening up slightly. Boeing, for example, is putting on 20,000 workers this week. Some big farming company in North Dakota is putting on about 2,000 workers. In Texas, some parks are being opened. In Florida, some beaches are being opened. So these are baby steps, if you like, but they are baby steps.
We have seen some pretty amazing protests there in parts of the country. People saying essentially that they're not living at the moment, so they might as well die. And they're quite adamant that they want to see freedom of movement restored.
That's right. In fact, it feeds into two things, Laura. The first one is obviously there's a lot of Americans who are very, very big on that sort of a notion of liberty or death. It's a very long tradition in their country. But the other interesting thing here, and this is really important, is there's protests, for example, in the western state of New York today. There's been protests, as you saw last week, in Michigan. Now, in New York City is, of course, a terrible death zone. But if you go outside of New York City to the western part of the state, the rates of the virus are relatively small. And people in those parts of the state are saying, hey, hold it, we don't want to be held by the same restrictions that people in New York City are getting. And it's precisely the same in Michigan. Detroit is a terrible area in Michigan, but rural Michigan is not very heavily hit. So these governors have a real dilemma in trying to balance their own state when there's two extremes in the one state.
Well, New York City, you mentioned, has been the epicentre for the United States, but there is some good news out of the city this morning.
This is how interesting it's all become. You know, relative good news is 478 deaths overnight in New York State, sorry. And that's, of course, a terrible count, but it is the lowest count, Laura, in 2 weeks. Hospitalisations are still going down. The rate of hospitalisations is going down. And so, you know, it's definitely past the peak in New York City. The question which the governor, Andrew Cuomo, said today, he said, look, we've plateaued, but how fast is it going to come down? This is a horrific death level still. Is it going to take weeks to come down? Will it come down quicker than that? Or will it be stubborn and stay very high for a long time? And he looked at the cameras and he just said, we don't know.